Let's make my Miscreant quilt pattern using only a layer cake, which are 10-inch squares. Now for this pattern, you will need 42 10-inch squares, which will yield you a 48-inch by 56-inch throw size quilt. So let's get started. With each 10-inch square, you will subcut them into two 5-inch squares and one 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle. Once everything is cut, you will select two 5-inch squares in mixed prints. On the wrong side of one of the 5-inch squares, you will draw a 45-degree line from corner to corner with a fabric marking tool. Then you will place the two 5-inch squares on top of each other, right sides together, and sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance on both sides of the line that you just drew. Then you will take a pair of fabric scissors or a rotary cutter and cut on that line that you just drew to create two half-square triangles measuring at a 4.5-inch square. Then you will pick a print to form this block, and you'll sew the two blocks together to form a 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle. And all you'll have to do is repeat this step to all of your 5-inch squares until you have made a total of 42 quilt blocks. Now here is a quick tip for my beginner quilters who are just learning how to sew on the bias. In the very beginning, cut two 5-inch squares and one 5-inch by 10-inch rectangle instead. That way when you form your piece blocks first, you will then measure a few of them and trim your remaining 5-inch by 10-inch rectangles to the exact same size. But once again, that print rectangle should measure as a 4.5-inch by 8.5-inch rectangle. Sewing on the bias can be a little bit challenging in the beginning, but this little tip will help make sure everything is the same size for when you piece your whole quilt together. Once all of your rectangles are complete, you will sew the pieced rectangle on top of your print rectangle to form a 8.5-inch quilt block. Then all you'll have to do is repeat this step until you have made a total of 42 8.5-inch quilt blocks. Now that all of your blocks are finished, it is time to lay your quilt out. And for every odd column, you will lay your block with the half square triangles on top. And then for your even columns, you will rotate them and lay your block with the half square triangles on the bottom. Then you'll piece them together within a 6x7 block layout. And as always, you'll sew your blocks together to form rows. And lastly, sew your rows together to complete your quilt top. And here's what my quilt top looks like all finished. For the backing, I am using a small floral print from within the collection. And for the thread choice, I am going with glide threads in the color Apricot Blush. And here's what my quilt looks like all quilted. One layer cake will yield you a 48-inch by 56-inch quilt. And if you use two layer cake bundles and instead make a total of 80 quilt blocks and place them in a 8x10 block layout, you will yield a nice twin size quilt measuring at 64 inches by 80 inches, just to give you a few more options. But if you could please take a moment to hit that like and subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you can be notified for your next amazing quilt project.